Hello, my name is Greg Colley, and I'm part of the Catholic Faith in Action ministry. Here in the fall of 2020, there is a great need for Catholics to carefully explore the moral act of voting. One of the challenges we have is that no single political party reflects our principles and values. We're fortunate to have great resources in church teaching on the process of forming our consciences so that we can be active Catholics and citizens at the same time. It isn't easy. What follows is a 6-part series recorded in video gatherings between September 30th and October 15th. We hope you find them useful. Thanks for watching. What we're going to do right now is we're going to talk about the moral framework. Now, this is a perspective that comes directly out of the bishop's document. These are some specific principles as that moral framework. Some of those principles are themes of Catholic social teaching. There are some other moral principles. And then we have a couple of other considerations. So we're going to walk through these. There's quite a number of subjects. I know that many of you are familiar with most of them already, but we do want to lay them down as a part of the foundation here and move through them just so that we have that framework established. So with that, Peter, I will move us to our first slide here.
All right. Thank you, Greg. So again, what we want to do in this section is talk about how Catholic teaching gives us a set of tools for thinking about political questions. We have a very rich tradition of reflection on these issues. The quote on the screen there is a quote from the California Bishops website. As I said, it's a great resource. Google California Catholic Conference in your spare time. And it refers to this concept of Catholic social teaching. And I know that many of you are familiar with this, but again, just to rebase everybody, what is this idea? Well, most of us understand that the church is empowered by the Holy Spirit to teach truthfully on matters of faith and morals. And morality can be subdivided further into sort of individual morality. Should I do this thing, avoid this thing? And what might be termed social morality. How should families and communities and governments organize ourselves so that all the members are able to develop into the fullness of what God called us to be? And the church has always had an interest in these questions, but particularly in the late 19th century, in the midst of a period of enormous social, economic, and political change, the church began to reflect more deeply on the social implications of the gospel. And so this took the form of papal encyclicals, documents from church councils, and statements from bishops conferences. And as new social challenges have emerged, as they tend to do, the church has continued to develop this body of doctrine, which is generally termed Catholic social teaching. Next slide, please, Greg. So, as you might imagine from a documentary history that is fairly long, Catholic social teaching is rich and deep, but there are certain themes that keep recurring, certain principles that we can then use to evaluate governmental policies, individual candidates, and so on. There's a document issued by the Vatican. It's actually really a book called the Compendium of the Social Doctrine of the Church, and it identifies 4 essential principles that it calls the very heart of Catholic social teaching. And these are listed on the slide in front of you. So the life and dignity of the human person, the common good, subsidiarity, and solidarity. And so we're going to spend a little time on each of these in turn. Next slide, please, Greg. So the first principle is the life and dignity of the human person. And so there's the first bullet point here is a quote from paragraph 44 of the Faithful Citizenship document from the U.S. bishops. And the U.S. bishops write, human life is sacred. The dignity of the human person is the foundation of a moral vision of society. Every human person is willed into existence by God, and as the book of Genesis teaches, is made in the image and likeness of God. And this is really the foundation of our notions of equality and justice. Society needs to be organized in ways that respect the sacredness of human life, its dignity, and allows for the full development of all persons that God has brought into being. And so laws and social practices that violate that dignity by treating some persons as inferior or less than human are fundamentally unjust and must be challenged because they permit actions that our tradition calls intrinsically evil acts, acts that are always and in every case wrong. And we'll be delving a little bit more into what the meaning of intrinsically evil later in the program. But, for example, as I'm sure you know, the bishops have always expressed a particular concern about abortion. In their introductory note to faithful citizenship this year, they called it their preeminent priority. So why did they say that? Well, because it strikes at the heart of this principle. A just society cannot be built if that society allows an entire class of human persons to be devalued, placed beyond the protection of the laws, and have their lives taken with impunity. And the bishops note that the sheer scale of the loss of human life due to abortion is one of the factors motivating their concern. At the same time, the bishops have made clear that there are, alas, many ways in which human life and human persons are devalued and degraded. And they list some of these both in the introductory letter to faithful citizenship and in the document itself. And they talk about the death penalty, racism, poverty, the death of non-combatants in war, the treatment of immigrants and refugees, the climate crisis. All of these are things that the bishops talk about. So this principle of the life and dignity of the human person is really foundational to Catholic social teaching. And what's clear is that we have a lot of work to do. Next slide, please, Greg. The second key theme of Catholic social teaching is something we've referred to already called the common good. Again, what do we mean by that? Well, the definition on the slide is from a document called Gaudium et Spes. That's the Latin title of a document from Vatican II called the Pastoral Constitution on the Church in the Modern World. And it says the sum total of social conditions that allow people, either as groups or individuals, to reach their fulfillment more fully and easily. And even that definition may be a little bit opaque, but think of it this way. The common good is the good that we need to work in common to achieve. In almost all cases, our ability to pursue an individual good presupposes a broader social context that makes that pursuit possible. So right now I'm sitting comfortably, more or less, in my house, chatting with all of you. But somebody had to build the house. Somebody had to regulate the building so the roof doesn't collapse on me. I have to have roads so that Amazon can come and give me that little camera that allows me to see you. I need police and firefighters to keep me safe. All of this so I can sit in my house and pursue my individual good of talking to you about Catholic social teaching. So government, various types and various levels, is one of the instruments by which we discuss and deliberate about the common good for a particular community. And so Catholic social teaching is not anti-government, even if we sometimes criticize government policies. What we want is good government. A good government will organize itself so that it is easier for all its members to do good and to be good and to become everything that God has created them to be, or as the quotation on the slide says, to reach their fulfillment more easily. Candidates sometimes will ask us, are you better off than you were 4 years ago? Well, a concern for the common good leads us to ask the question, are we better off than we were 4 years ago? Next slide, please, Greg. The third core principle of Catholic social teaching is subsidiarity. Another one of these big words. What do we mean by that? Well, again, this is something that's always been part of the tradition of the church, but particularly in the 1930s, the church found itself facing off against totalitarian regimes of the right and the left that wanted to have the state take over all of social life. In Nazi Germany, they forced you to be a member of the Hitler Youth. You couldn't be a member of a church youth group because that was independent of the state. And so the church said, no, this is wrong. The purpose of the state is not to replace all the institutions of civil society, that is family and churches, businesses, labor unions, Rotary clubs, or what have you. Its purpose is to support them, to help them grow and serve their purpose, and to intervene only when they are no longer able to do so, or when certain decisions just need to be taken at a higher level. Now, obviously, that's where the debate comes in. I mean, some people might invoke the principle of subsidiarity to say, well, decisions about what kind of housing should get built in a community should always be made by an individual city because that's the level of government closest to the people living there. But someone else might say, well, the failure of some of these local governments to build enough housing is evidence that a higher level of authority needs to come in on behalf of the common good, since housing is so basic to our ability to pursue other goods. So again, people can debate these principles. But I would say that a concern for the richness of our kind of face-to-face and associational life, small-scale human and economic relationships, really has been at the core of Catholic social teaching for a long time. Next slide, please, Greg. And then finally, the fourth major principle of Catholic social teaching is solidarity. What do we mean by that? Well, the definition of the slide states that it affirms the unity that we all share as God's children. Another way of thinking about it is biblical. We are our brother's keeper, our sister's keeper. We follow the example of the Good Samaritan, even people who don't necessarily talk like us or look like us. And so we practice the virtue of solidarity when we have a deep commitment to the flourishing of every individual as someone with human worth and dignity, which ties back to the first principle. Then as a political community, we are called to institutionalize that commitment in our laws and policies to, once again, make it easier for human persons to do and be good and to achieve the fulfillment for which they are created. And sometimes, again, solidarity and subsidiarity have to be held in productive tension. You could imagine a government very concerned about solidarity and equality coming in and being very aggressive about, taking over a lot of things, but that could lead to a certain type of statism, which wouldn't be a good outcome. On the other hand, if you allow maybe too much autonomy to sort of local and small institutions that they can't be coordinated in some way, you could have the breakdown of social order and community. So again, as you're evaluating public policies and candidates, you have to keep both of these principles in mind and both of them in a productive tension. Next slide, please, Greg. So as you might imagine from the fact that some of this more traditional language about solidarity and subsidiarity, lots of big words, our American bishops have tried to boil this down in language just a little bit more accessible. And so they've come up with 7 themes of Catholic social teaching. And it's very much the same ideas, but the language is a little more accessible. And our bishops have called out a couple things a little more clearly around a preferential option for the poor and, dignity and rights of workers, which can sometimes be challenging in an American context. I would strongly encourage you to Google Catholic bishops and 7 themes of Catholic social teaching. There's some wonderful resources on the U.S. Bishops website that will go more deeply into the 7 principles. The other thing I highly recommend is there is a video series that the bishops have developed with Catholic Relief Services called Catholic Social Teaching 101. And literally, if you just Google CST 101, you'll get taken to the webpage. There's some really great videos, very beautifully done, and it's really worth your time to check those out. So I think at this point, Greg, I'm supposed to turn it back over to you.
Yep. So what Peter just walked us through are the themes in the principles that come from Catholic social teaching and the context for them. What we want to talk about now are a few moral principles that are really important ones to bear in mind, some of which we've touched on already. The 4 of them are up on the screen. You see this. It's a consistent ethic of life, intrinsically evil acts. There are aspects of this that are important to understand. Then we're going to get into this notion of cooperation with immoral acts. These are kind of important, and we're going to use examples as we go through here that are simple examples. But in point of fact, these are actually very relevant to what we, as Father Lawrence mentioned, there is no political party that matches Catholic moral convictions perfectly. Therefore, we have to consider the gray areas. So that's part of what we're going to go through here. And the last one is double effect. So let's walk through these.
Greg, excuse me.
Yeah.
Can I ask a quick question?
Sure. Yeah.
There was a question, or there was some wording on one of Peter's slides about it used the word immediate that I didn't quite understand. Keep going backwards. One more. Okay, the most immediate level of society, is that the most, what is that?
Yeah,
What is the
immediate
most
meaning.
immediate?
Yeah, ideally, it's the level closest to the point where the decision is impacting. So, again, going back to this example of housing, if you're discussing like what housing gets built in Concord, the most immediate level might be the Concord Planning Commission or the Concord City Council. And ideally, a decision that really was affecting Concordians, should be made at that level. But as I mentioned, there are times when a decision that a city could make might negatively affect the broader community if they're only thinking about their own community. And so then you might need a higher level of government or society to step in and say, we really need all cities in Contra Costa County to agree to a certain amount of affordable housing, say. And again, that's where the debate is. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I for some reason I expected it to say the most vulnerable in the community, but I think I understand that it's most, this is does this mean that the decisions
The
being
closest.
made most closely affect those who it will affect?
Yeah.
Or is it a geographic situation?
I mean, it would depend on the type of decision. I don't think it has to be geographic, but often that, can be the case. But you could also imagine, I don't know, a set of policies that affect a particular community, even if that community is not, like, say, I don't know, veterans. Let's say the government was making a set of policies around veterans. Well, you would want to consult the veterans in multiple places, perhaps, not necessarily just in one locality. So, does that
Okay.
help?
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you.
Okay, so let's jump into the fun of the starting to get into the gray area of moral principles here. The first one, this is kind of a bridge, and this is an idea that bridges between Catholic social teaching and an array of themes there. And the idea of imposing a moral principle on our decision making. Part of this is about making sure that there is a consistency about this ethic of life, the life and dignity of the human person. And I just want to share this. This is a quote from John Paul II from Evangelium Vitae. Where life is involved, the service of charity must be profoundly consistent. It cannot tolerate bias and discrimination. For human life is sacred and inviolable at every stage and in every situation. It is an indivisible good. We need to show care for all life and for the life of everyone. And I just want to hold on this for a moment and maybe invite reflection or comment. There's a lot of dimensions to Catholic social teaching. A lot of principles, some being preeminent, maybe more preeminent than others. But this is about the fact that the idea of life and dignity of the human person is as important in our thinking in many areas as it is in others.
Yeah, if I may comment on
Sure,
this,
yeah.
Greg. And so this consistent ethic of life is really important for us. The bishops have indicated that his preeminent concern is the life of the unborn, and so this is a concern that gravely should concern every single individual in the church, and be a big part of our decision making going forward. However, it isn't the only one, and this is where the word consistent comes in. If we're for that, if we are for life, it's not just the life of the unborn, so that is a really important concern, perhaps supersedes others. That's the terminology the bishops are using. That does not mean, and bishops have made this quite clear, that this in any way sort of like diminishes the importance of our ethic of life for all other concerns, for the poor, for the hungry, for the needy, for the homeless, for the immigrant, the undocumented immigrant. As far as racial injustice goes, that's also part of the consistent ethic of life. And so we as Catholics want to make sure that we're aware of all of these and not just focus on one particular issue to the expense of all the others. That's not really our consistent ethic of life teaching. And so we do want to keep this, solidly in mind.
Thanks, Father Lawrence.
Yeah.
Now, we want to make sure that we have a good definition of intrinsically evil acts. So we kind of want to walk through the Church's thinking about this, the Church's definition, and provide some concrete examples that have been cited by the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops and the Church as a whole. Just so that we have an understanding of what we're talking about here and can then employ that understanding as we go forward in our discernment. So the first thing that's important to remember, these are acts that are wholly incompatible with love of God and neighbor. The great commandment, love God and love your neighbor as yourself. Well, these are things which are in direct conflict with that. Secondly, there are also acts which are so deeply flawed that they're always opposed to the authentic good of persons. I think that phrase stands on its own. There's just no way to interpret some acts as being a good for anyone. Core notion here, therefore, becomes the intentional taking of human life, and this specificity begins to create some challenges in our thinking on a political level. Finally, they are acts which violate the sanctity and dignity of human life unequivocally. And let's consider a few things, therefore, that the bishops have called out as acts which can never be justified. By the way, we are going to talk about what never be justified means across the next few minutes and also into the next evening. But let's just consider a few. Abortion and euthanasia, okay? And Peter has already talked about these are direct threats to human dignity because they directly attack life itself. The bishops have also called out genocide, torture, and the targeting of non-combatants. And these are, in our lifetimes, not abstract notions. These are things that we have seen directly around the world, and to a certain extent, as a country, have participated in ourselves, either directly or by providing the means by which some of these things can happen. Last 6 months, of course, have sharpened our understanding of trends that have been going on in this country for not just decades, but centuries, and that is the intrinsic evil of racism. There are many people now doing work to understand this much more deeply, which is a reason for hope, but it is also still, systemic racism is still something which is common in our country. A couple of others that have been mentioned, treating workers as means to an end, deliberately subjecting workers to subhuman conditions. Again, these are things, this is something that happens in this country, but more importantly, it also may be a part of products that you have in your pocket right now. So this is where we need to begin considering the implications of something the Church has defined as an intrinsically evil act and how we engage in it. Another important one is treating the poor as disposable, treating the homeless as not just second-class citizens, but just objects to be moved around. Right here in Concord, we have a practice of what's called leaf blowing, where the police take homeless people and simply move them out of the downtown area because they are cosmetically undesirable. That's treating poor and homeless as something that just needs to be an object that needs to be moved out of sight. And finally, redefining marriage to deny its essential meaning. this is as a list. You can see there are the ideas here, the definition, but then there are these specifics that have been brought up by the bishops and called out because not only have they existed, but they are present to us right today. I just want to pause for a moment to ask if there are any questions about any of these. Dennis, you unmuted. Does that mean that you have a...
Yes, it does, Greg. I'm just kind of wondering why the nuclear arms race is not listed under these things. Is it, that the bishops, just don't want to tackle that, that it's too much of a political hot potato? It certainly seems like war, and especially nuclear war, are, abhorrent to the gospel. And why that wouldn't be listed is, beyond comprehension.
Well, actually, I think it does come up indirectly. First of all, I do want to comment that I'm aware that the bishops have actually published, I can't remember when it was, in the 80s or 90s, I think, a document on nuclear war specifically. And this also brings up territory, which is sort of the just war theory, which is an interesting place in Catholic moral theology because it basically argues across time that maybe there are reasons for just reasons for war, but like the killing of execution of criminals, it's very difficult to get to circumstances where it seems like it's actually necessary to do that. So I wouldn't say, Dennis, that they don't speak to it. They do. It's not on this list, except in one fashion that I'll mention. Targeting of non-combatants. There's almost no way that nuclear war can not affect non-combatants. And therefore, I would say that nuclear war, by extension, is actually on this list. And the bishops do tackle it in other contexts. So that's not maybe entirely responsive, but I hope that answers your question a little bit. Thanks for the question. I want to talk about this notion of cooperation with an immoral act, because this is actually kind of critical to our... We're going to talk about it more in the next couple of sessions, but we've already spoken to the fact that there's no political party that matches our convictions perfectly. Therefore, when we vote for a particular political party, we, to a certain extent, are going to be cooperating with an immoral act. So I want to walk through this so that there's a decent understanding of what we mean here. So this is kind of harkens back to scholastic theology and categories, but I think you'll get the idea. There is this idea of formal cooperation. Formal cooperation is when we share the intent with the immoral act. And you see that little red bar sign there, which is we don't want to go there. That is, we do not want to formally cooperate through sharing intention with an immoral act. Then there's this idea of material cooperation. It's cooperation. It's the way we should think about providing concrete support to enable an immoral act. Again, this is something we do not want to go there. These are the two ways in which we may cooperate directly with an immoral act. But then we have to think about some considerations. There is what's called proximate cooperation. That's about making a contribution to an act that leads to the commission of the act. And that is, we share culpability with the act if we engage in proximate material cooperation. Necessary cooperation, well, that is understandable from the standpoint of our cooperation is necessary for the act to happen, right? Again, this is not a place that we want to be with respect to an immoral act. But now let's talk about remote cooperation. And this is the important part of this slide. I think the rest of these are probably pretty understandable. Under remote, you're not going to see a sign there that says don't go there. You see a caution flag. And that is because it is about making a contribution to the act that does not lead to the commission of the act. There is no necessarily sharing of intent. Okay? So it becomes a question of, well, if you don't intend for the act to happen, and there is the cooperation, the material cooperation of is at some distance. You're not promoting it. You're not doing it. You're maybe just engaging on some level that's relatively distant. Then it becomes something that we need to examine in with some specificity. Circumstances matter, and if there is a serious reason to do what you're doing that might be construed as remote cooperation, then the act can be justified. I want to give an example here. This is a trivial example, but I think it will help. Let's just say an IT worker fixes an internet connection so that a student can complete his schoolwork, right? That's a good act. But now let's say that that student uses that internet connection to cheat by changing his grade. Well, now the question becomes, did that IT worker bear some responsibility for the cheating? And under the notion of remote material cooperation, the answer would be no, because what he did in terms of repairing the internet connection was a good act with good intentions and was not directly connected to the secondary act. Now, if you think about this for a minute, this is actually a place where voting all of a sudden takes on the kind of tremendous importance, this principle, because we are going to have to consider voting for candidates or parties or other acts, propositions, you name it, that may not be directly consistent with Catholic teaching. And so we need to figure out if we are in a place that comes under this heading of remote material cooperation. Is there a basis? And the basis there needs to be a serious reason if we go down that path. Part of the process of forming our conscience, as you'll see when we get into the next couple of evenings, is understanding exactly what those bases are and whether or not they match the gravity of the issue at hand. So I just want to, this is kind of technical Catholic moral theology, but I can't overemphasize the fact that that last point is a really key one in our coming to an understanding of how we might exercise our right to vote. I hope everybody kind of understands what I'm getting at here. Is there any question? I just want to pause to see if there's a question about this. It's technical language. I understand that part. Part of this is sharing the concept so that we have the tools, as Peter said. I'm not seeing any flags go up or anything on unmute, so I'm going to go ahead. By the way, this conversation tonight is at the level of principles. We're going to get further and further into particulars while we'll be using these. So the last one that I want to mention is the principle of double effect. And this is basically the sort of unintended and unavoidable consequences, not the intentional consequences, but things that follow on. The church understands that actions may be taken which have impacts that are not intended, but clearly could be construed as an immoral act. Well, the church also provides some guidance. There are questions that can be employed. And I don't want to kind of go down too far into details here, other than to point out that when we get these gray areas like remote material cooperation or the notion of unintended consequences, the church provides tools, questions, ways of thinking through what's going on to come to an understanding of what the moral implications are and therefore what we should do. The classic example that comes from St. Thomas Aquinas of double effect is the killing somebody in self-defense, in your own defense. Clearly killing somebody under normal circumstances would be construed as an immoral act. But the self-defense part of this means that you're defending yourself, and the death of whoever was of the assailant was an unintended consequence. Okay, part of the fact of the grappling with voting as Catholics is we sometimes have to think very carefully about the possibility of unintended consequences. I work in a hospital, and I will tell you that one of the which has a big birthing center in it, and it is a very difficult set of circumstances when the question comes up that the pregnant mother is having health issues, or the embryo or fetus is having issues, and a decision has to be made about whether one life or the other. Only one life can come out of a process, and therefore a decision has to be made. The moral thinking goes into high gear to try to figure out what is the right way to do the best in a really difficult situation. And it's a very complicated array of decisions that have to be made. But the good news is we have tools to do that with. I just want to wrap up with a couple of other important moral considerations. And I certainly would not be surprised if questions come up on this, practical, immediate questions. The first one I want to raise is this notion that a good end cannot justify an immoral means, right? The ends cannot justify the means. I'll give you a simple example. Stealing to give to charity, right? The giving to charity is a good thing. Stealing to do it is not the way to get there. I'll bring up maybe a little bit more acute example. Making sure that we take all steps necessary to reduce crime is a good thing. Wrongful imprisonment of people who are, or actually putting them to death, of people who actually turn out to be exonerated, there is no way that the good end of reducing crime can be used to justify wrongful imprisonment or wrongful execution. These are things that happen. Okay, so this is where we can talk how important it is to consider that a good end cannot justify an immoral means. There are, one of the ways we struggle in terms of considering how to vote for specific parties or candidates is to hold our nose is the notion that comes up. And, one of the questions we have to ask ourselves is, what exactly are we tolerating in order to attempt to get to a good ends? How many immoral means are we accepting, and is that justified? I think this is a really important principle for us to consider as we form our consciences over the next number of weeks. The last thing I want to point out is this principle that not all possible courses of action are morally acceptable. There's a simple example here. A couple simple examples. And Dennis, you'll appreciate this. Legitimate defense. That is an important good of government, to provide for the defense of the people. But then if you start looking at the one course of action, which is ballistic nuclear weapons versus a conventional defensive force, you can begin to ask the question, well, sure, ballistic nuclear weapons are possible, but are they morally acceptable? One of the great ironies, of course, of the nuclear age in terms of weaponry, of the people who invented them realized very shortly after that they had done something that was probably not morally acceptable. Another example that I want to provide is something that's important in Catholic teaching, and that is the idea of family planning. There are a couple different mechanisms that can be used for family planning. Contraception is one. Natural family planning is another. Family planning is a good thing. It is an important aspect of family life. But not all possible courses of action are morally acceptable when it comes to how Catholic families might choose to do that. So again, I think that part of this is that we get a lot of tools from the church, from church teaching, to help us as we go through. We've provided some of these principles tonight. We're going to get more specific as we keep going along here, as we talk about process and get into the practical aspects of this. But our last little summary here that I want to offer is something that gets repeated over and over again by bishops, either collectively or individually. Certainly, I know in the article that I mentioned earlier about Bishop Zubik talking about not being able to tell Catholics how to vote, he did very clearly say that political decisions are moral decisions. And that's why we have these moral principles included tonight in this presentation. We have said this in a number of different ways, that therefore political decisions should be aimed at the good of society and every individual, I just want to underscore that. So we're going to look at the process of making moral decisions in part 3, okay? And in part 4, we're going to look at some places where the church has already done some important work on some topics that will help feed our thinking as we go through these ideas of forming our consciences. So I think this is where we're going to wrap up tonight. I just want to pause here and invite comments, questions. I'm going to actually stop with the slides for a moment so we can give priority to happy smiling faces. I hope you're not all smiling because the slides are gone and that we're wrapping up. This evening has been important foundational ideas. This evening is slightly different than the other evenings because we will have more room to flex our discussion muscles as new topics come up over the course of the next couple of sessions. But this stuff is really foundational, and it's difficult to legitimately understand what the church means by the formation of our consciences, our informed consciences, if we don't have this foundation in place. So to the extent that this may not have been as riveting and entertaining as it otherwise might have been for a Zoom session, I hope you understand why we wanted to offer this material. But questions, observations, comments, critiques, if you have any complaints, talk to Laura. And I'm going to unmute everybody, or at least send a request that you unmute.
Hey, Greg, this is Tina. Can you hear me?
Louder.
1 second. Can you hear me now? Is it better?
We can hear you.
Yeah, go
Yes.
ahead.
Hey. So I wanted to thank you guys for organizing this because I need help in forming my conscience. And I think just this part 1 is just so powerful and very good foundation. And I really learned a lot tonight. So thank you.
You're welcome.
So I have a comment like from the first part, and when Father Lauren said something about, so when somebody has a difference in belief, in moral belief than you, that it's good to have a dialogue. And I wanted to ask Father, like, advice, like, what if you lack courage to start dialogue? And because maybe you're afraid to be, like, judged or persecuted. And are you practicing your Catholic responsibilities when you don't get in a dialogue, but you just stay on the sideline and you just, pray?
Oh, that's a good question, and I think you have to be judicious in those decisions. Pray is definitely the way to start a conversation, a difficult conversation. But it also takes fortitude. It's one of the cardinal virtues. One of our primary virtues is to be strong, and to get out of our comfort zone from time to time to bring these things to the fore. Respectful, of course, always. Finding the right moment, and certainly doing your homework is really important so you can make a good presentation, of what it is that you're trying to help the other party understand, but then listening closely to what they have to say as well, respectfully as well. Hopefully that kind of helps. Pick your timing, carefully, but don't be afraid to do so. This is actually part of what we've been talking about the whole night, is to get our voice out there, and in our own personal decision making as we participate in the process, to form our conscience as well. Does that help, Tina?
Yes. Thank
Good.
you.
Well, I note that the clock just ticked 9 o'clock. How's that for delivery on time and on schedule? I want to, before we close, Grace, were you raising your hand?
No, I'm clapping.
Oh, good.
Oh, it's the clap. What is that?
So that we'll send out an email reminder for the next session, which is not a week. It is actually on Thursday evening, because there is a debate on the Wednesday evening. Peter has put some links into the chat box. I just want people to notice that. We will offer those links again, and maybe a couple of, to steer you towards a couple of resources that were mentioned tonight, especially the videos, the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops videos, and the California Conference's website. Some terrific resources there, which a lot of tonight was drawn from. We're going to get more practical next week, and feel free to begin the process of reflecting on some of this and thinking about political commitments versus faith commitments. But I want to stop with an act of prayer. And so I just invite everybody, it's going to sound noisy because I'm not going to mute everybody. If you're on mute, it won't be quite as bad. I just want to invite everybody to join me in the Lord's Prayer. Our Father, who art in heaven,
In heaven,
hallowed be thy name.
hallowed be thy name.
Thy
Thy
kingdom
kingdom
come,
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 thy
thy
will be
will
done,
thy will be done
on
on
earth
earth
as
as
it is in
as it
heaven.
is in heaven.
in heaven.
Give us
Give us
this
this
day
day
our
our
daily
daily
bread,
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 and forgive us
forgive
our
us our
trespasses,
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 as we
as we
forgive
forgive
those who
those who
trespass
trespass
against us.
against us,
against us,
and lead us
Lead us not
not
into
into
temptation,
temptation,
but
but
deliver us
deliver us
but
from
deliver us
evil.
from evil.
Amen.
For
Amen.
thine is the
Amen.
kingdom, the power, and the glory.
Thanks for the full conclusion there. Thank you, everybody, for coming tonight.
Thank you,
It's
Greg.
wonderful to
and
have you
Peter.
here.
Thank you,
hope
Greg,
to
for all your
see you
work.
next week. Sure. Look forward to next week. And if you have any questions or anything, feel free to stick around. I'm not going to slam the session closed immediately, but thank you for coming.
Thank you, Greg.
Thank you.
Very good. Good night, everyone. Thank you.
Good night, Father.
Night.
I have a quick question.
Yeah, sure.
So next, I already have Zoom meetings set up for Thursdays. So will this be recorded like tonight so I can